Well, you all wanted me to talk about Mollymauk. So here I am. Open the video by flicking the cap off of a bottle of wine and drinking a swig of it. She thought that'll be funny. They thought. Hello, I'm Jess Galaxie, and welcome back to my YouTube channel, which is slowly turning into a Critical Role Campaign 2 fan page. I'm kidding, but I do want to talk about Mollymauk since I mentioned it in my Essek video, and a lot of people actually asked me to do a Mollymauk video, so here we are. For starters, I just want to say that this isn't going to be nearly as long as my Essek video, nor is it going to be as cohesive, or maybe it would be better to say that it's not going to be as chronological. I did that video in a very specific way, kind of starting Essek from where he was and going forward. I can't really do that as easily with this video because it's more about themes. Either way, please let this be less than 36 pages or at least less than 2 hours after I edit it. Also, for the sake of this video, I'm going to skip the full explanation of what Critical Role is and instead give you an abbreviated version. Critical Role is an actual play Dungeons & Dragons live stream that airs most Thursdays on Twitch and YouTube. An actual play is any show where the cast is playing a tabletop role-playing game, like Dungeons & Dragons, directly in front of you without any edits or cuts. Though some of that is changing a little bit, with especially things like Dimension 20 taking off, which is more edited. So I wouldn't say that it necessarily has to be unedited anymore, but generally you do have to be just playing a TTRPG in front of an audience for the sake of entertainment. The best way I can really describe actual plays is that it's like watching an improv performance with the format of playing a TTRPG over top of it. In the case of Critical Role, the cast is a group of friends whom are all voice actors and fairly famous in their own right. This, combined with the cast's energy as a group, has rocketed Critical Role into quite a bit of success in the TTRPG actual play sphere. So with that out of the way, let's talk about Mollymauk Tealeaf, Taliesan Jaffe's tiefling bloodhunter from Campaign 2 of Critical Role.
You have no legal authority over me!
Part 1. Who am I dressed as? I'm kidding. To explain Molly, I really need to start by discussing the eldritch being that is Taliesan Jaffe. From what the public knows of him, Taliesan Jaffe is a kid raised in an entertainment family who started his career as a child actor, and honestly, reading his Wikipedia page is kind of hilarious. Especially this line. After 6 years of acting, he did not enjoy being a child actor after a bad audition. His father told him he could either put in more effort for more roles or quit acting, and Jaffe, having not previously realized that quitting was an option, immediately chose to quit. Eventually, Tal returned to the entertainment industry as a voice actor, primarily working in dubbing anime. He took a few on-screen roles here or there. Most hilariously, he was on House MD as a Renaissance Fair actor, which is just completely on brand for him, and eventually, through some connection I am unaware of, he started playing Dungeons & Dragons in Matt Mercer's basement, as all of the other main cast members of Critical Role did. Taliesan has always brought an incredible dark humor and wit to the table since the start, and after playing a sort of mad scientist crossed with every white-haired anime boy, Taliesan created Mollymauk Tealeaf, a character who by far became one of the fan favorites of Campaign 2 of Critical Role. When we were first introduced to Mollymauk Tealeaf, or Molly, the entire fandom kind of immediately fell in love. Admittedly, I was not involved in the fandom at the time, but based on what I've heard from my mutuals on TikTok and some of my friends, this was basically 100% the case. A purple tiefling covered in tattoos, traveling with a circus, and wearing an incredibly brightly colored coat, Mollymauk was a strong standout character design, and his personality really lived up to it. Mollymauk's personality was vibrant. He wasn't afraid to tell it like it is, and despite his own lenient view on crime and moral ambiguity, Mollymauk was an important emotional core to the group from very early on. The main cast of characters in this campaign that Molly knew consisted of Caleb Widogast, Not the Brave, Jester Lavore, Bo, Ford, and Yasha. Despite being closest with Yasha, Molly fit directly into the Mighty Nine even when she wasn't around, and had some form of good relationship with every character on the team, whether it was his slightly antagonistic relationship with Bo, his immediate kinship with Jester, and his consistent, vaguely threatening flirting with Caleb. All of it contributed to both a fast friendship with the player characters and also a quick rise in fans who would absolutely die for him. which, reasonably, he deserved. Thing is that Molly was off the charts charismatic, and I don't think that was intentional considering his actual charisma score in the game was only an 11 at level 5. And actually, let's talk a little bit more about Molly's stats in class, because I think it's interesting, but bear with me, I have to explain D&D rules to you all. And last time I so much as mentioned specific rules about a spell and how I personally interpreted a scene in my Essek video, I never heard the end of it, so I'm going to be annoyingly thorough. Don't condescend to me. My main thing on TikTok is talking about Dungeons and Dragons. I know a lot about it, and I've been playing for 10 years.
I'm your god. Long may I reign. Eat of my fruits.
Jiggle, 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 jiggle. It took me a really long time to get these horns to actually stay in my head, and this, like, headband is... Oh. I'm really nervous about this one falling because it's got an earring in. I didn't put the back into the earring just in case it did fall so that it would just pull out instead of, like, tearing my ear. I'm afraid. Molly, as I mentioned earlier, was a Bloodhunter, a homebrew class made by Matt Mercer, which is... I'm not gonna say bad. Bad is not what I'm going to say. The thing is that while Matt Mercer is a wonderful world builder and has brought many great things into D&D, the original Bloodhunter class was fine, sort of. They're really, really cool. They're basically witchers, which is fun, but at any level below, like, 10, they can just abruptly die. And we saw that happen with Mollymauk. I'll talk about his death later, though, so for now, let's focus on this. So the reason that Bloodhunters can just kind of, like, suddenly die is because Bloodhunters sacrifice their hit points or their HP and, you know, whatever, to be able to do more damage during fights. This is perfectly fine if you have enough HP to balance out the amount you're sacrificing, or you have a healer around to help balance it out. However, your HP is determined by your Constitution score in D&D. For each level, you have HP equal to the amount you roll on one of your hit die, which is just a dice you roll to see the amount you get, which is different for every class, the lowest being a D6. Then you add your Constitution modifier. So for example, a Bloodhunter gets a D10 hit die per level, and if their Constitution is 14 like Molly's was, they get to add +2 at each level, meaning the maximum HP Molly could have had at level 5 was 60 HP, which he was actually very close to with a 59. The point is that Molly had almost the max hit points he could have in this situation, and it still wasn't enough to save him. Molly really needed to have a healer around to make his build viable under level 10, and in this situation they didn't have a healer around because several characters had been kidnapped and they were trying to save them. I will talk more about that later, don't worry. But ultimately, Molly didn't even choose Constitution to be his dump stat, meaning the stat that he had the lowest score in, and he was still significantly at risk for this sort of situation. Matt Mercer has since tweaked this class, and I think there's a big reason for it. He might have also tweaked it because Travis Willingham wound up playing a Bloodhunter werewolf in Campaign 3, but based on when the original tweaks happened, I'm pretty sure the biggest reason was Mollymauk's death. However, something else I want to talk about with Molly's stats is the fact that his second highest stat after dexterity was wisdom. Now, I think this is largely because he was playing using this variant feature mentioned in the Bloodhunter page, which allows you to use your wisdom modifier for your class features rather than your intelligence modifier. I'm focusing on this because I think it really speaks to how Taliesan was role-playing Molly, and also explains some of the things that we're going to talk about later on in this video. But let's start with how Taliesan was role-playing Molly.
Just gently socially pin Caleb to the wall.
Molly, as a character, like I mentioned, was often an emotional core to the team and a driving force to keep them together even before his death. He could be frustrating for other characters, but then he'd turn around and say something like this.
If they seem grumpy or angry and seem overly concerned with an enormous amount of money that they happen to have, or using it to just be mean or cruel to somebody, that's probably a sign that they'd just be much happier if they just knew exactly who liked them. And the only way you could ever really know if someone likes you is if you don't have anything over them. And the easiest way to get to that honesty is if you don't have anything.
So you're saying steal from grumpy people?
Oh, yes.
Shitty people, specifically.
He was clearly, to some extent, a con man, his coat bearing the sign of nearly every approved god of the Empire, which, yes, the Empire had approved gods its citizens were allowed to worship, and somehow the dynasty was the bad one in Campaign 2. Anyway, still salty. Molly kind of openly admitted to being a con man too. As he put it,
I spent 2 years before I met you all
cajoling people, occasionally ripping them off, occasionally doing a good turn here or there. Never trust the truth. Truth is vicious. The truth thinks that you owe it something. None of that. I like my bullshit. It's good, it's happy, it makes other people happy.
So even if he was doing things to make people happy, Molly would sometimes do it at the expense of others. He wasn't above humiliating someone so long as it felt they deserved it, and he also didn't treat the truth like it was the end-all be-all. Sometimes telling the truth isn't the right move. I think we all know that. It's this kind of interpersonal wisdom that Taliesan brought to Molly that was really interesting. This brings me to another significant part of Molly's character that Taliesan played in an incredibly interesting way. When you start to dig into Molly's backstory, he just gets, like, kind of concerning. Like, if one of my friends rolled up to a D&D campaign with this particular character, I would be so concerned from the very start. For one thing, he pretty openly discusses the fact that he doesn't have any memories prior to him crawling out of a grave 2 years prior to the start of the campaign. Yasha discusses the fact that when the circus first found Mollymauk, all he could really do or say was empty. If you noticed, Mollymauk Tealeaf, or MT, is a homophone for empty, and frankly, Taliesan Jaffe is more clever than I ever will be. That's it. That's all I wanted to say about his name. Taliesan is just more clever than I ever will be. I accidentally gave one of my characters a last name that translates to Shitfield, so yeah. I had a point to this, though, and that's that Molly is only 2 years old when the campaign starts, because, you know, he crawled out of a grave 2 years ago and has no other memories and had to learn how to be a person again. We also learn that Molly has always had the red eye tattoos on his body, and that he tried to hide them a bit by adding tattoos to conceal them. We found out later that there was actually a lot of plot built into Molly, both with his backstory, which Matt Mercer had full control over, and also how Taliesan played him. There's a trope in D&D of the amnesia character, a character who has no memories prior to the events of the campaign or shortly before the campaign begins. This is the kind of character a lot of story-focused GMs love, because rather than having to take existing ideas of who this character was and bake them into your plot and world, you get to decide what the character was doing before, and the player just kind of has to accept that. Within reason, of course. Like, most GMs and players talk this stuff out and sort whether they want the character to have been a villain or a hero prior to the life they're currently living. But otherwise, the GM has an incredible amount of control over those details with an amnesia character. That being said, Molly really fits into this trope. Taliesan could play him however he wanted, but ultimately Matt got to decide where Molly had been before he got put into that grave. I think that's what's so interesting about all of the insight and intensity of Molly's character. Taliesan had no idea what Molly's previous life was ultimately going to be, and neither of them had any idea that Molly's death would end up being one of the most defining moments of the entire campaign that would shape literally all of the other characters' arcs. Hell, if you saw my Essek video, Molly's death was even influential to an extent on Essek's character arc, and Essek never even knew Mollymauk. I think it's also significant to mention that the one time we see Molly dealing with the fact that he did have an entire life before he crawled out of the grave, he tries to brush it off and avoid it as much as possible. What's interesting about the way Taliesan chose to play Molly is that Molly was an amnesia character who didn't care to find out who they were in their past life. As Tal put it, he was just supposed to be a body that just kind of kept going after the soul had died. This is an interesting way for Taliesan to have played the trope of the amnesia character. It's very rare to run into someone playing an amnesia character where their character's main goal isn't to find out who they were or where they came from before they lost their memory. Characters like this might decide eventually that they don't need to know or that they don't want to know, but often their initial goal is to find out who they were before they lost their memory, which wasn't the case for Mollymauk in a way that I found very interesting. When you combine this with his ability to be incredibly insightful, his larger-than-life personality, his humor, and so many other things, it made Molly a character that was honestly unforgettable, which I think made his death far more impactful for both fans and the cast.
With blood.
Oh, God.
So I actually want to start before Molly's death, because Molly's speech to Beau right before his death was one of the best moments of the early campaign in my opinion. Voiceover Jesse, here to correct something that I said in this video. I was trying to say that Molly's speech about leaving every town better was one of the best moments in the early campaign. It does not happen the night before he dies. I mixed up when those two things happen, so this actually happens in episode 14, this clip that you're about to see. Molly told Bo this.
I always tried to be helpful with when I turn cards for people.
You ever think you could actually be doing damage, though? No. Setting people on false paths?
People are looking for a path, they're looking for a path. And I'll tell you, and this is true, I did my best every town I went to and every town I left, no matter how they treated me, and a lot of them treated me with deep disrespect.
Some people are vulnerable and looking for answers.
I left every town better than I found it.
Which I've seen countless fans venerate in fan art, in songs, in so many ways. It was a very impactful speech for more than just the cast and more than just the player characters. But it's something that Bo takes entirely to heart and kept bringing up for the majority of the rest of the campaign.
Leave every place better than you found it. Do you still intend to leave the world better than you found it?
Shortly before they enact a plan to try and rescue their friends from a group of slave traders who kidnapped them. They quickly realized that the people they were fighting were much more powerful than they'd realized, and because of the ability I mentioned earlier that Bloodhunters have where they hurt themselves to be able to attack, Molly was low on HP rather quickly. When he went down, he was right next to the leader of the people they were fighting, who promptly drove a glaive directly into his chest. This happened live. Hi. My camera turned off. I thought I just finished recording. I did not. My camera didn't make any noise when it turned off. So, I'm gonna do a quick outfit change because I have been in this for almost 2 hours, and then I will be back. Sorry for this abrupt little commercial. Oh, okay. Feeling a little better. Honestly kind of feel like I actually need the wine now, but that's a different conversation. Anyway, let's just get right back into what I was doing. Like, no one expected it. Things took a really poor turn, and then Matt Mercer had his villain just outright murder Mollymauk. It threw people off. Like, I'll never forget the tweet he put out afterwards because he was already sure he was going to get hate for that decision. And I'm going to emphasize, that decision made sense and was perfectly in character for who he was playing in the moment. This left Caleb, Not the Brave, Bo, and Keg, a guest character, to deal with the aftermath on their own. Shortly after, Taliesan's new character, Caduceus Clay, was introduced, and they were able to save Yasha, Ford, and Jester. However, when Ford, Jester, and Yasha find out about Mollymauk's death, it also changes things within their characters. After this, Jester starts obsessively collecting diamonds so that she'll be able to cast Revivify, a spell that can bring someone back to life so long as it's cast within a minute of them dying, to ensure that something like this never happens again. Molly, for all intents and purposes, became a symbol of the Mighty Nine. Like, even the animated intro leaned heavily on the imagery of his grave, and the cast did a really good job of never forgetting him in character. Even after Taliesan's new character comes in, they would still talk about Molly in this fond, realistic way. The way you talk about someone who passed away suddenly, and you may have reconciled with their death and your feelings about it, but that doesn't mean you don't miss them and that you don't still feel the urge to talk with your loved ones about them, and especially the loved ones that also knew them. Even in moments between just two characters, you see them going back to Mollymauk, talking about him, discussing what it meant to have him in their life. For example, Bo and Yasha talk about him on their first date, because he meant so much to Yasha, and Bo had never had a moment to talk with her about what happened before that moment. And again, I just want to remind you that none of this was planned. It's just what wound up happening because of a roll of the dice. However, it's also crazy to think about it when Matt had planned all along for the BBEG to be tied directly to Mollymauk's backstory. Now, of course, everything that's happened with Mollymauk and his death gets far more complicated when Molly's body is suddenly up and moving, but Molly isn't in it anymore.
Facing you is death. It's not necessarily a bad thing, Lucien, you know?
So, Matt Mercer had planned from the very start that the Cognoza would be the final battle of the campaign. And it wasn't, but we're gonna ignore the fight that they had with Trent Ickathon, the worst wizard in the world, during the finale of the show. Anyway, Taliesan revealed that apparently he had first come up with the idea for Mollymauk during the first campaign. When his character Percy died, Taliesan had plans to bring this character with this character concept into that campaign. However, because his friends did such a nice job during their resurrection ritual, Taliesan decided to bring Percy back to life, despite him saying originally that he wouldn't. I'm really only telling you this because it means that Matt knew about Mollymauk long enough for him to literally plan his campaign around him being tied to the BBEG. Originally, Lucien was supposed to be showing up in various bodies, trying to get his body back from Mollymauk. Of course, that plan got ruined when Molly died in session 26 of a campaign that wound up being 141 sessions long. Matt pivoted by having Cree, a Tabaxi woman who first called Mollymauk Lucien and told them about Lucien, and is the reason that we knew that Mollymauk didn't care to find out who he was before he wound up in that grave, go and resurrect Lucien back into Mollymauk's body. When the Mighty Nine discovered that Cree had resurrected Mollymauk's body, they had a feeling pretty quick that this wasn't going to end well if they let Lucien just go free. For one thing, Lucien could do this incredibly creepy thing where if someone used magic to spy on him using the scrying spell, he could see them doing this and would frequently speak directly to them as they did it. So the way the scrying spell works is you essentially have a little orb that's invisible that pops up around the person you're scrying on, and that's what you're seeing through. The thing is if you have an ability that allows you to see invisible objects, you'll be able to see the orb. Mollymauk clearly had something like True Sight, which allowed him to see the scrying orb whenever someone was spying on him. And he used that to his advantage to make people feel deeply uncomfortable. And I know it doesn't sound uncomfortable as I'm explaining it, but in context when you're playing D&D, if you are scrying on someone and suddenly they look up at you and it's clear that they know that you're there, it's gonna feel a little unsettling. So all of this resulted in the final arc of the campaign involving the Mighty Nine chasing the body of their dead friend into the ruins of an ancient city of mages to prevent him from bringing about the apocalypse via allowing a portion of that city to come back from the astral sea because it had turned into this like eldritch flesh monster. I want to emphasize that this was somehow always the plan. Not exactly, but Matt had always planned for the team to be running around Aeor in the final arc of the campaign. Anyway, the Mighty Nine were hired by one of the worst wizards in the world, aka the Cerberus Assembly, to travel to Aeor as her guards. Vestaragna, the member of the Cerberus Assembly who hired them, was also trying to bring back the Cognosa, or the portion of the city which had turned into an eldritch flesh monster. However, Lucien promptly killed Vess in cold blood the moment they stepped foot on the continent of Isocross, leading to a kind of race to get a few magic items so that the Mighty Nine could prevent Lucien and the Tomb Takers from bringing the city back. I explained all of this in the Essek video before, but basically what you need to know is that the Mighty Nine wound up spending several tense days actually traveling alongside the Tomb Takers under a tenuous treaty, resulting in them nearly dying in a fight against the Tomb Takers, but particularly against Lucien. The Mighty Nine then ran off to the outpost where Essek was at to beg him for his help, which is how he ends up involved in this whole situation and traveling with the group into Aeor to set up a trap for the Tomb Takers. Okay, here's the thing. Arguably, Taliesan Jaffe created Lucien. He created Mollymauk and therefore gave Matt the whole idea for all of this. He was also probably Lucien's #1 downfall in the campaign, because Caduceus, the character he had been playing since Mollymauk died, just kept succeeding on divine intervention, allowing him to find out where the secret entrance to Aeor that the Tomb Takers were planning to use was, so that they could go and set up a trap there. Now, I want to point out that divine intervention only has like a 15% chance of working. Anyway, the trap that they set worked like super well and resulted in the death of most of the Tomb Takers. It literally left just Lucien and Cree alive. Unfortunately, those two managed to escape. They rushed their way to the Cognosa, desperately trying to bring the city back before the Mighty Nine could stop them. However, Lucien sacrificed Kree because he never really cared about her in easily one of the saddest scenes in the entire finale, and then he imploded the Cognosa, managing to take its power for himself, leading to the final battle of the campaign, an intense fight which killed both Jester and Caleb at separate points. Despite their very best efforts, Lucien and Kree do not succeed in bringing the Cognosa back from the Astral Sea, and Lucien dies in the fight against the Mighty Nine, who are now left with the body of their dead friend. So, of course, Caleb sets his transmuter stone on Lucien's chest with the intention of trying a resurrection ritual to bring Mollymauk back to life now months after he'd originally died. Emphasis on months. Not years, it had only been months since all of that happened. And this is where things get wild.
Hey! Back in the game. Time for that later.
So Caleb, and therefore Liam O'Brien, start the resurrection ritual to bring Mollymauk back to life. Really quick before I get too into this, I want to explain how Matt runs resurrection rituals in Critical Role. He does this way to kind of prevent the issue of characters being unkillable, meaning they could just keep getting brought back by the party cleric and move on over and over and over again, which kind of makes the stakes of D&D feel a little bit fake. So to combat this, Matt had the players do a resurrection ritual. This ritual involves 3 players, each making different skill checks to convince the soul to come back. Matt then rolls a final check to see if the character is resurrected. Each of these ability checks are usually one of the core ability stats of D&D and are supposed to be representative of the character using that ability to bring their friend back. This is a very interesting way of doing it because it kind of forces them to roleplay these moments, but it still attaches a specific mechanic to it, and the players know that. So, for example, they could say that their character carefully patches up the wounds that are left on the body, and that could be considered using intelligence, and therefore they'd make an intelligence roll to try and bring the character back. Now, since the players know that Matt, the GM, will have them make a roll based on what they say, they'll try and push their roleplay towards a certain ability, but they're not the one picking the ability that they use, meaning that sometimes a player will make a roleplay choice and Matt will say make a charisma check, even though that might not be what they're going for and might actually be an ability they have a very low score in. This is something that happens to Yasha in Mollymauk's resurrection ritual. It just adds an interesting dynamic to this whole situation and makes it significantly more stressful for the players, which is why I use it in my campaigns. Now, this does not strictly work either. If the player, for example, chooses not to bring the character back, they can just say no. So if Taliesan didn't want Mollymauk to come back, he can just say that he doesn't. And that was actually Taliesan's original plan for Percy in Campaign 1, which I mentioned earlier. To further set the scene for this resurrection ritual, I want to give some context about the Cognosa, which I've mentioned briefly, but I want to put further emphasis on here. The thing about the Cognosa is that it was a congealed flesh monster made up of a portion of an ancient city of mages that existed during the Age of Arcanum, which in most of D&D lore refers to a period of time where humans had learned so much about magic and grown so advanced that they were rivaling the gods. Eor in particular was seen as so dangerous to the gods that the prime deities of Exandria and the betrayer gods worked together to destroy it. Like, the betrayer gods and the prime deities were having a war with each other already, and they paused because they went, okay, this over here, this is really messed up and we need to put a stop to that now. Like, that's how bad Eor was. And also, just to keep in mind, Eor was originally like a floating city that floated around all of Exandria. And there were many cities like that during this whole war between the betrayer gods and the prime deities and all of the stuff that was going on. In fact, they literally like... It's a whole thing. If you want to watch EXU Calamity, it's very interesting. Anyway, carrying on. When Eor was destroyed, the Cognosa ward of the city, which was run by a group of leaders known as the Somnovum, escaped. In the process of this escape, the entire ward was fused into the aforementioned Eldritch Flesh monster. It wound up trapped in the Astral Sea in what seemed to be an excruciating amount of pain. So when the Mighty Nine defeated Lucien, all of the souls in the Cognosa ward were finally released to move on. When the Mighty Mighty Nine was in the remains of the Cognoza with the body of their dead friend, who moments ago was an entirely different person, who was very much trying to kill them. They were watching the visual representation of all of these souls being released into the astral sea to move on. So when Caleb held his transmuter stone to Molly's chest and the Mighty Nine began the resurrection ritual, they were very aware of two things. One was that Molly, according to Lucien, was only a fragment of Lucien's soul rather than his own person. Now, the Mighty Nine firmly believed this not to be true, but it was still something they were very aware of while this was going on. And two, they could very well perform the ritual and get Lucien back and not Mollymauk. Which is why when they all rolled their skill checks and Matt rolled the final roll and this happened...
As the light gathers around the body, the magic attempting to reach out into whatever space holds the souls here in the astral sea, as so many go scattering outward now, to search for one, a fragment of one, or is it a whole one? If souls can grow from but a piece, to try and reverse the trajectory of that one, if it is indeed available.
Oh no!
I can't believe that just happened.
They couldn't bring their friend back. This was their last chance and it didn't work. Honestly, there's nothing sadder in the entire campaign than this scene right here.
There's nothing else to do. Caleb.
Like I said before, Yasha was closest with Mollymauk before he died, and she didn't even really get to say goodbye to him when it happened. This entire scene is incredibly rough because, as I said in my Essek video, even Essek cries over it, and he didn't know Mollymauk. Bringing Mollymauk back to life meant so much to these characters, and the fact that they'd failed really truly felt like a bitter end to one of the most grueling, roughest dungeon crawls these characters had ever been through. And they had been through some rough ones. Which is why when Taliesan Jaffe asked if he could roll for divine intervention and he succeeded, the entire table exploded.
Your eyes open for the first time.
Bolts up and runs.
Wait, no! I'm chase after.
Honestly, I was not watching live when Mollymauk died, but watching Critical Role Campaign 2 episode 140 live was one of the most euphoric experiences I have ever had in my entire life watching a piece of media. Twitter was insane, posting on TikTok afterward was so much fun, everyone was legitimately so happy, and it was like 3 in the morning, and it was just great. Matt said the phrase, "You open your eyes for the first time in months," and there was truly nothing better than those words, and you could see in the player's face that that was true. Of course, Mollymauk was back to where he was when he first met Yasha in the circus. He was only saying the word empty, but he did recognize the group in some way, calling several of them by a signifier that definitely referred to how he knew them in his past life. Yasha's being love, Bo's being groomer, Ford's being sea, Jester's being joy, Veth being tinkerer, and Caleb being magician. So this wasn't just based on their physical features either. It was key to who Mollymauk remembered them as from when he was Mollymauk. It was wonderful, and honestly, in the moment, it was the perfect ending. I even made a few TikToks talking about how this was really the only reward the Mighty Nine would get for what they did, which was literally saving the world. Because leading up to this point, nobody really knew about the threat to the world that the Cognoza was. The Mighty Nine had told a few people, but really no one had any idea outside of that. This wasn't like defeating a dragon and getting to raid its horde. There was nothing in the Cognoza. There was only the fact that they saved the world and they might get their friend Mollymauk back, which for a moment we thought they did.
Empty.
Okay, so I want to start this section by saying that I respect Taliesan Jaffe in his infinite wisdom and his penchant for making characters that are really hard to cosplay. Look at his last 2 characters for Critical Role. Actually, his last 3. Caduceus is hard too. Anyway, however, Taliesan Jaffe, if you ever see this, I have just one question for you. And that is, you really couldn't have let us just have this one? Like, you really couldn't have? Anyway, to explain, episode 140 ended after the resurrection ritual and a lot of happy hugging before they used plane shift to get out of the astral sea and return home. Then, episode 141 started with them arriving in the Blooming Grove where Caduceus Clay lived and they first met him. Honestly, with how important Mollymauk was to this campaign, I just have to say that it's sort of poetic that the majority of the final episode was spent in the Blooming Grove, the home of Caduceus Clay, the reason that he came back to life. That being said, the Mighty Nine started to regroup once they arrived at Caduceus's home, his family welcoming them with open arms, just happy that they all survived, honestly. Because frankly, when they all left, they said their goodbyes as if they might never come back. This is when Bo and Yasha have a quick conversation about whether they should be calling Molly, and how they're unsure if that's even Mollymauk. When this happened, I was immediately worried because this conversation set off alarm bells in my writer brain. And writer brain is just when you're watching something and you think to yourself, well, logically, this is going to happen next because that's what I would do with the plot. And then you're usually right and you're a little bit disappointed about it. I heard this conversation between Bo and Yasha and thought to myself, oh no, that's not Mollymauk. They're setting something up. And I was correct, unfortunately. Because in the next moment, Jester went over to Mollymauk, who was still only saying empty, and cast Greater Restoration on him. This resulted in it becoming very clear very quickly that this was another fragment of Lucien's soul. This was not Mollymauk Tealeaf. This was just another body with no soul moving forward. Thus, we met Kingsley Tealeaf, a fragment of Lucien's soul who named himself Kingsley because he felt like a king. He hated Mollymauk's clothes, but after a bit of talking to the Mighty Nine, he, unlike Molly, wanted to hear more about his past life and who he was before. He even claimed Mollymauk to be his brother, choosing to take the Tealeaf last name to represent that. Okay. Listen, I well and truly love everything about this. I just wish it hadn't come at the expense of the story beat and euphoric high that was having Mollymauk Tealeaf back. The thing is we didn't really get an explanation for it. Taliesan explained his thoughts on Molly as a character originally, a body that had been brought back to life and just kind of kept going without a soul, but that's really all we got so far as an explanation, and that didn't really explain it, but that's really the only explanation we got. And I understand why he did this. It does fit with the original character concept that he came up with, and technically it does answer the divine intervention that he chose, which was whatever it was, just put it back. But there really is nothing that will ever convince me that this wasn't, at least in some way, detrimental to the story that the table was telling. Or was it? Yeah, okay, this is the point where the essay flips a little bit. Maybe it feels antithetical to the story many people thought Critical Role was trying to tell in Campaign 2, but honestly, in retrospect, Kingsley still very well fits into that story. The thing is as I wrote this video essay, I thought this final section was going to be entirely about how I felt a bit like Taliesan ruined the resolution of the final arc of Campaign 2 of Critical Role, but as I wrote the essay, I don't think he did, especially after going back and thinking about things and having written my essay. He really didn't. So many of the stories in Campaign 2 were character-driven stories about letting go of the past and moving on. From the very simple version with Jester literally just leaving home and changing her name to have an adventure, to Caleb and Essex's incredibly complex relationships with their past and how they needed to move forward, to Bo's literal rejection of her family name, and Yasha needing to grieve her wife's death and get rid of the shackles of grief to be able to move on. Literally none of these stories were about clinging to the friend who they lost in a fight trying to save each other. And that might seem a little harsh, but I do think it's true. I know that not having Molly come back at the end feels a bit like breaking up the found family of the D&D campaign, something that was a really strong theme in this campaign, not only because the characters grew really close and became a family, but because there were so many queer characters in this group. And well, you know how the gays love their found family. I'm bi, I'm allowed to say that. Anyway, but I do think Mollymauk not coming back and Kingsley being there instead actually works really well within these character story arcs that we got. It's maybe not the ending you wanted, it's maybe not the euphoric high of episode 140, but it's a really good ending, and I think that's why a lot of people did respect Taliesan's decision. And in episode 141, Yusa, one of the mages that they frequently worked with and had to help throughout this, assured the Mighty Nine that there would be rewards for what they did, and frankly, the Mighty Nine continued to be together. Caleb traveled with Essek and wound up being romantically involved with him. He was able to see Veth whenever he wanted. Yeza became part of his family, and so did Luke. Yasha and Bo moved in together, and Yasha got to rest and be a housewife. They eventually had a gaggle of children. Ford and Jester finally figured out their relationship and went off on more adventures together, and probably eventually settled down as well. And they even joked in the wrap-up that they would probably all go to Rumblecusp at times and hang out together. And also, Kingsley went with Ford and Jester and eventually stole their boat, rechristened it the Mollymauk, and left to become a pirate, as Taliesan said Mollymauk would have loved to do. Honestly, I understand fan reactions to all of this. I really do. A lot of people felt like the whiplash of thinking that Molly was back to actually that's not Molly was incredibly harsh. I know what it's like to have a comfort character who ends up being the character in the show or media who dies. It sucks, and I understand why people were so upset when they thought Mollymauk had come back to life, and then there was the euphoria excitement around the fan favorite character being alive, and then it wasn't true. I was really sad for a really long time that things didn't go the way that I wanted or expected. Frankly, I'm still sad in a lot of ways. I still think it would have been really cool for Molly to have come back, but I think that it's part of the beauty of the way that the story was told. Not just because it was realistic in a lot of ways, or that it had really dramatic highs and lows to it, but also because of things like Taliesan choosing to stick to his character concept so hard, he kind of did the exact same thing twice.
Alright, big kiss on the forehead and I'm walking away.
Anyway, thank you all for watching this video. Please don't roast me for saying that Molly not coming back was good, actually. I really do love Critical Role Campaign 2, and finishing this video feels like it's really ended for me because I don't really have any more videos about it planned. I did come up with another idea for another Essek video essay, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. I have worms in my brain and they're shaped like long Essek. I don't know. Tell me in the comments if you want me to talk about anything else in particular from Campaign 2. I'm always open to talk more about it because this campaign was such a comfort for me, and I've been rewatching it recently, and it's really a reminder of just how much it became a really important part of my life, and a big part of the reason that I have the following on TikTok that I do. So a lot of the friends that I've even made on TikTok are because of Critical Role. So I'm always here for talking more about it. Anyway, as always, thank you so much to Molly, my friend who helps me edit these videos. The horns that I was wearing earlier in this video were made by my friend Phoenix at Aravir on TikTok, so thank you so much for that. I'm really excited about how they turned out, and they looked really nice. Unfortunately, I could not wear them for this whole thing, and also I'm not very good at working with magnets. Here are all of the other places that you can follow me. I also have a Patreon now, so maybe consider supporting me on there, perhaps? I hope you all enjoyed this video, and have a good one, guys. Bye. You know, like that comic that was like a meme with the dog playing fetch where it's like, no take the ball, only throw? I feel like I am that dog, and I am here like, I both want Kingsley, but I also don't want Mollymauk to be gone. Like, no Kingsley gone, only Mollymauk and Kingsley.
Because I'm weird!
That track.